All right, welcome everyone to the second part of the sensation and perception chapter. Let's begin. All right, so I want to start by talking about subliminal messages. This is one of those questions that I had for you in the very first lecture. This is one of those psychology myths. Again, there's this idea out there that subliminal messaging can somehow have a huge influence on our behavior. There's even movies where, CIA agents can be activated by saying a secret code word, suggesting that they had some sort of subliminal training that they've completely forgotten about. There's a very good reason that this idea of subliminal messaging exists, but we're going to talk about the reality of it in the beginning of this lecture here. So I want to recap by talking about absolute thresholds. If you remember, an absolute threshold is the bare minimum intensity required for us to perceive a stimulus. And you need to perceive that stimulus at greater than chance level. So you need to perceive it at least 50% accuracy, which means that if you present a very low intensity stimulus, there will be some times where you correctly identify that stimulus, but you're not correctly identifying it at that greater than chance level. This kind of opens up a can of worms, a bigger discussion that I don't want to get into right now about how research statistics works. You'll definitely cover that if you go on to any sort of statistics course in the social sciences. But for now, just know that there are times less than that 50% accuracy level where you do accurately detect a low intensity stimulus, but you don't detect it at a very accurate rate. So that's what we're talking about here, these subliminal messages, these subliminal stimuli that we're presented with that are presented below that absolute threshold level. So, on some level, we're aware that we were subjected to a particular stimulus, but we're not quite aware of it. We're not totally consciously aware of it. So that's the kind of stimuli that we're talking about, just below conscious level, just below our absolute thresholds. So the question here at the root of the matter is, can a subliminal message influence our behavior? And the answer is a little bit nuanced here. There is one side that says, yes, we can be influenced by subliminal messaging. So, and unfortunately, this isn't all that exciting. This type of influence is very brief and it's very minor. Um, it's not all that exciting. It's nothing even close to what you might see in a sci-fi action movie or something like that. It's very brief, and usually it's done in experiments where you present someone with an ambiguous word, like the word bank. A bank could be a financial institution, or a bank could be like a riverbank. And what you do is you ask someone, okay, define the word bank for me. And if they were subliminally exposed to words like money or teller or bills or loans, they will, if they were subliminally presented with words like that, and then you ask them define the word bank, they will most likely say a bank is that building, it's that financial institution. But if you subliminally prime someone with words like water, flowing, and then ask them, what does the word bank mean? They will be more likely to say things like a riverbank. And that's about it. And that effect only lasts for a matter of seconds. It's not like you leave the laboratory and every time you see the word bank after that, you're going to think of a river or anything like that. So it's very short lived and it's very minor. So that's kind of the kernel of truth to this subliminal messaging idea. But again, there's a very good reason why this idea persists. There was a man back in the 50s who, his name is escaping me now, he did these studies and he was like a freelance marketer, and he did these studies on the effect of advertising and how that influenced sales. And he was specifically looking at how you could increase sales in movie theaters. And so he had this idea where you could subliminally flash people logos of companies like Coca-Cola or Snickers or M&Ms, and then they would secretly crave those products. So you could flash people these logos, and then film's intermission would come up, and they would rush to the concession stand and buy these products. Well, he kind of fudged his data. He basically lied about how successful this technique would be. But people bought it up. He got rich a little bit from it. But before long, some actual scientists looked at his data and realized, hey, this doesn't really reflect what we're finding in our own laboratories. All right. I want to finish up the sight sense by talking about Gestalt grouping principles. So Gestalt grouping principles, these are organizational principles explaining how we organize basic visual information as it comes into our visual processing system. So it's sort of the first line of defense in how we make sense of that tsunami of visual information that we are subjected to all throughout the day. So that first step of organizing the information, it really helps the steps later on to make more and deeper sense of that information. So by organizing it, we can make sense of it and recognize it much more efficiently, much more quickly. So we're going to talk about these grouping principles at the bottom of the slide there: the figure ground principle, the proximity principle, similarity, closure, and good continuation. All right, starting with the figure ground principle. So in this grouping principle, when we are looking at our visual field, so when we have our eyes open, we typically organize that incoming visual information where we have a figure, which is the fore part of the visual field, the part of the visual field that's closest to us, and then we have the background of our visual field. And this organization, by creating this dichotomy in our visual field of having the foreground, which is the stuff in our visual field that's close to us, and the background, which is the stuff that's far away from us, this allows us to immediately focus on the foreground, the stuff that's closest to us. That's usually the stuff that we pay attention to more in any picture. We typically ignore things that are in the background. So in this picture here, we've got a pretty obvious example of the foreground and the background. We've got this dude at the top of the mountain, raising his arms. At the summit, that's definitely the foreground. And then the mountains and the sky and the clouds in the background, that's the background. So you probably did this automatically the first time you glanced at the image on the right side of the screen. And I'm willing to bet that without thinking about it, you immediately separated that picture into a foreground and a background. So that's kind of what I'm talking about with these grouping principles. It's a very early step in the visual process. Sometimes we can play around with this figure ground principle, and I'm sure you've seen an image like this before on the left. This is one of those ambiguous pictures, ambiguous images. Depending on what you determine is the background, that will change what you see in the picture. So for those of you who don't quite see it yet, if you make the black part of the image the foreground and the white as the background, you'll see two faces kind of coming together, maybe for a kiss or something like that, but two faces very close to each other, facing each other. Now, if you swap it around and make the black part of the image the background and the white is the foreground, then you'll see a candlestick or a vase or something like that. And once you realize that, you can kind of switch and flip-flop between the two. What's the foreground and what's the background? All right, let's move on to our next grouping principle, which is proximity. So the idea with this grouping principle is that we tend to group things together that are close together. So if objects in our visual field are in close proximity, we tend to think of them as a single group, a single cohesive unit. A couple examples on the slide here. If I just showed you this picture on the left here, you might see one group of dots down here and several different groups of dots up here on top. So we've got individual dots kind of scattered across the top part of this image. We tend to see each of these dots as individual units. They're not grouped together. They're not close together relative to this block of 9 dots down here that are in nice uniform proximity. They're very close to each other, almost touching. So again, in your visual field, you'll have objects that are scattered about, and we tend to think of those as individual units. And then we'll have objects that are closer together, and we'll tend to think of the group as a single unit made up of individual units. And we can use this grouping principle of proximity in the real world too. So taking a look at this sign right here, it's a little hard to read at first glance. Car products on, car now sale. A little bit confusing at first, because what you're trying to do is read the words that are close together. But you quickly realize that this huge gap between the words is actually how you're supposed to read it. You're supposed to read it from left to right, left to right, left to right, going down the rows. But that's not how your brain wants to read that information. It wants to read the words that are close together in one group. It doesn't want to jump this huge gap here to read the next word. Car care products now on sale. Look at this huge gap right here. This would fail like a basic graphic design course or something like that. So that's the proximity grouping principle. Elements that are near to each other in our visual field are typically grouped together. All right, next one, we have similarity. So in this grouping principle, elements that have similar features are grouped together. And this idea of similar features can take many different forms. It could be color, it could be shape. So we've got an example of shape here. On the left, our very simple example. If you take a look at this, you don't typically see columns. What you typically see is rows. You'll see a row of circles, a row of triangles, another row of circles, and another row of triangles. Your brain is organizing this into 4 rows of shapes. What you don't typically see is 5 columns, a circle, triangle column, a circle, triangle column, because those are different shapes. We tend to see the shapes that look like each other grouped together into rows as opposed to different shapes grouped together into columns. Another real world example here, we've got a bunch of fruit in a grocery store in the produce section. And someone has gone through the effort here to group all of these pieces of fruit together. And once again, you typically see this image in terms of columns because the different colored and shaped fruits are arranged that way. You don't see rows, which would put many different types of fruits together. All right, so we've got proximity, we've got similarity, we've got the figure and the ground. And next we've got closure. So you can experience closure when our visual perceptual system tries to close gaps or complete missing parts. This is when we try to fill in the dots, extend lines all the way. Nice little example here on the slide. It's pretty easy to see the light bulb in the picture. We've got the little screw part at the bottom of the light bulb, and then this hand is creating the typical shape of a light bulb. Plus the white background doesn't hurt either. So again, our mind is sort of looking for those gaps to be filled in, those missing parts. There's no light bulb here. You can see there's nothing here from the tips of this person's fingers to the bottom screw part of the light bulb. But our mind easily fills in those gaps and through this principle of closure creates the overall impression of a light bulb. Good continuation is another one of these grouping principles. And the good continuation idea is that if an edge is occluded or blocked from our vision in some way, we assume that it continues on in what we consider a regular way. So if we have a line or an edge, and there's a portion of that line or that edge that we can't see, we assume it continues on in a way that we would expect. So take a look at this image on the left. What you typically see, what your mind helps you see because it makes the most sense, is you've got two kind of squiggly lines here, and they sort of make an X. You've got one squiggle that goes this way, and then you've got the second squiggle that kind of goes like this, like a really stretched out letter S or something like that. And they cross each other right in the middle. This would be a regular way for these lines to continue. Now, what you could just as easily see, but you typically don't, is two lines that have like almost a 90-degree turn right here. So you might have this line comes to this intersection and then continues here. You might have this line reaches this intersection and continues on to the end over here. So you'd have almost like a greater than and a less than sign just touching right there. That's not typically the way we would expect these lines to continue. That's not a regular way for these lines to continue. So maybe it'll make more sense in this image on the right here. We've got this cow sneaking through the fence there to check out this little gosling or duckling, whatever that is. And we have a part of the cow that is blocked from our vision with this fence post here. Now, it's a good bet that behind that fence post, you are going to find the rest of a cow. You're going to find the middle section of a cow. It would be very surprising if you looked behind that fence post and there was just a gap in that cow. There was no continuation of that cow's body. In fact, that's not something that we usually even think about as a possibility. You probably looked at this image and it did not occur to you to think, I wonder if there's the rest of the cow behind that fence post there. Because of course there is. The vast majority of times, and probably any time that you're going to see an image like this, if you look behind that fence post, you're going to see the rest of what you expect to see, which would be the rest of a cow. So this is good continuation. Our mind kind of fills in these gaps. It makes these assumptions that most of the time make sense. So these Gestalt grouping principles, we covered some of the main ones here, and these help us organize information before it's assessed for meaning. These principles are automatic, which means they're very fast, and they happen very early in the perceptual process. So these are things we don't even think about. Again, remember, we've got just a huge amount of incoming visual sensory information all throughout the day. These grouping principles help us organize and perceive that information in an efficient way. And I think this highlights that a lot of our processing, specifically for vision, a lot of our processing occurs unconsciously. We're not aware that we're engaging in these Gestalt grouping principles. They just happen. In fact, they happen so automatically that we're really only aware of them when rules are violated. So take a look at this example over here. What in the world is this card trying to tell us? My mind wants to read it from left to right and then down the rows. So you will know, show you how to design lead. I really don't know what that's trying to tell me at first glance. Eventually, after staring at it for a little bit, you figure out that it's trying to tell you, we'll show you how to lead, you know how to design. So it's trying to tell you two different messages here. But they kind of broke these rules of proximity, Remember that sign advertising a sale on car care products? Kind of the same idea here. They're sort of breaking these rules so that it makes it harder for us to digest the information very quickly. All right, so moving on to a couple other different processing principles in vision, we're going to talk about size perception. So, one of the big ideas here is that our perceptual processing systems, whether it is vision or hearing or any other sense, we use contextual clues to help us make perceptions. When we're trying to make sense of incoming sensory information, we will use all available information at our disposal, and a lot of that information is based on context. What kind of context are we receiving this information? If you remember our talk about bottom up and top down processing, this is definitely on the top down processing side of things. So take a look at these images down here. Let's start with the one on the left. We've got this black dot in the middle of some small gray circles, and then we've got the black dot in the middle of some large gray circles. Now, you may have seen this before. This is a pretty common visual illusion, but these two black dots are the same size. You can move one on top of the other and it will take up the exact same amount of space. But just looking at these two black dots, it appears that the one on the left is bigger than the one on the right. This is because of the context that these two different dots are in. The one on the left, relative to the gray circles, it's huge. It's much bigger than the gray circles around it. So for its context, it's very big. Compared to the one on the right, the gray circles around it are very large, so the black dot looks small in comparison. So our mind is using those contextual clues of the size of the surrounding shapes to help us make a size perception. And in this particular instance, it's a little bit of a mistake. You may have seen the one on the right as well. These two horizontal lines here are the same length. They have these different greater than or less than, or you might call them like arrow marks on the end. And they appear to make the horizontal line a little bit longer if they're open-ended, or a little bit shorter if they're closed-ended. So again, our mind is looking to these contextual cues to make perceptions of size. Okay, maybe you've heard of the Ames room illusion. I've got a video for you guys linked on the Canvas page. Now would be a good time to pause this video and check that video out. This is just like a family video of a family visiting one of these Ames rooms illusions, and they kind of have some fun with it. They play around. This is that illusion you may have seen where you go from one corner to the other and it looks like you grow rather dramatically or shrink rather dramatically depending on which corner you're going to. Go ahead and watch that video now. All right, and the explanation for this illusion is kind of summarized here in this image. So you're looking in the direction of this arrow, and you're looking at two people standing in the different corners. In one corner, and the room is really funky. It's not shaped like a perfectly square room. You've got one corner that's really far away, and the other corner is actually much closer. That corner that's closer is actually raised quite a bit so that your head is much closer to the ceiling. And sometimes the ceiling is actually decreased as well, it's brought down. That far away corner, the floor is not raised and the ceiling is not dropped. So think about that. You've got some major contextual clues for size perception in this room. The one that's far away with the ceiling that's really far above their head, those are contextual clues. So that is something we make size perceptions based on. This corner that's very close, where your head is very close to the ceiling, your mind is going to look at those contextual clues and make a perception of someone's height based on that information. So if you switch corners, you can see a pretty dramatic change in our size perceptions. All right, so that's all I want to say about vision, and I want to move on to our sense of hearing now. We're going to focus on our sense of hearing, and then we're going to briefly touch on touch, smell, and taste at the end of this lecture here. So moving on to hearing. So the path of information in hearing looks like this. In this image here, we've got our ear diagram. The sound waves enter the ear, they travel down the ear canal, it's also called the auditory canal, and they strike our eardrum. The eardrum takes that vibration and sends it through the smallest bones in our body, the malleus, incus, and stapes, and these three bones kind of act like a little tapping device, and they tap on the cochlea. And the cochlea is this fluid-filled structure. And so the airwaves, that's what sound is airwaves, hits the eardrum, travels into the cochlea, and in the cochlea, those airwaves turn into basically fluid waves, and those fluid waves travel down the cochlea and they stimulate hair cells. I'm going to show you a picture of those hair cells in just a second, but hair cells are these little they're cells, and they've got hair-like structures on one end of them. When they're all lined up together, it kind of looks like a lawn full of grass or something like that. And they're sitting in this fluid. Think of like seaweed just kind of like hanging out in the ocean. And as those waves flow through the cochlea, they get stimulated. Those hair cells kind of get knocked over a little bit, or they get stimulated. They're kind of floating around in that fluid. And when they get stimulated, when they get knocked over, they stimulate the sensory receptors that are attached to the base of those hair cells. And those sensory receptors take that information, move it on to the auditory nerve, which is the main bundle of nerves that take information from the cochlea to our cortex, to our brain. And the auditory cortex is where this is where conscious hearing occurs, conscious auditory perception. All right, here is an electron microscope image of a cochlea. This, I believe, is a rat's cochlea, and parts of this cochlea have been injected with a type of dye that will glow under this microscope. So you can kind of see its curly Q-shaped structure. It's kind of got a spiral structure going on. And you can see this line here, these red and green lines that kind of follow that spiral on down. Let's take a closer zoomed in image of those neurons there. So the red that we saw spiraling in the cochlea, or excuse me, not red, green, the green, those are our hair cells. They literally look like hair. These little neurons, these spiky heads of hair, those grass blades that need clipping. So these hair cells, again, they're sitting in the fluid-filled cochlea, and those airwaves that travel through the eardrum into the cochlea, they are eventually traveled down these hair cells, and some of these hair cells get stimulated. When they get stimulated, they move around a little bit. And when they move around a little bit, that triggers movement in the hair cell. And that movement is sent on down to these sensory receptors, these sensory neurons, which are these dyed red neurons down here. So when these red neurons receive that stimulation from the hair cells, they send it on to the auditory nerve and eventually onto the auditory cortex. This is a wonderful, wonderful image of what's going on in the cochlea. All right, so let's talk about the physical dimensions of hearing. Hearing is typically measured in two different dimensions, and that's pitch and volume, or loudness. Pitch refers to the frequency of a sound. We can have very high frequency sounds or very low frequency sounds. So let's see, where are we looking here? Yeah, at the bottom of the image, we have two examples of the different types of frequency. So sound is a wave, and we can measure waves on a graph pretty simply. In our x-axis here, we've got time, and then our y-axis is going to be amplitude. So we've got a high-pitched sound represented on the bottom right here. You can see these waves are very close together. That's what I mean when I say frequency. So frequency is the amount of time it takes for a full wave cycle to occur. So you've got full wave cycles that are occurring rather rapidly represented on this graph. Now compare that to the left-hand side of the bottom of your image here, and we've got like less than one full wave cycle represented on this graph. So this would be a very low sound, a deeper pitched noise, compared to the higher pitched noise that this sound would represent. So that's frequency, the number of waves, number of sound waves that occur in a given time period. The higher the frequency, the more sound waves that are occurring. The lower the frequency, the less sound waves that are occurring. And the other physical dimension is loudness or volume. And this is going to be represented by the amplitude of a wave. The amplitude is the measurement here, the crest or the climax of the wave, the hill, the mountain, the peak, compared to the valley, the low point of the wave. So the more extreme amplitude is, the louder that noise is going to be. So the higher this peak and the lower this valley, the louder that sound is going to be. And that's represented in these two different graphs here. This would be your quieter sound. That's a much smaller amplitude on this wave. And this would be a louder sound because this is a higher amplitude. So amplitude and frequency. Frequency represents the pitch of a sound, and amplitude is going to represent the volume of a sound. So let's talk a little bit more about how we measure sound. You may have heard of the decibel scale. And the decibel scale is a way for us to attach a number to that wave amplitude. It's a way for us to measure with an objective operational definition of what sound volume is. Now, you might not be aware that the decibel scale is it's actually logarithmic. And what I mean by that is that it doesn't increase in a very logical fashion. So if you go from 5 decibels to 10 decibels, that does not mean that you have doubled your volume. So if you go from 10 to 20 decibels, again, that doesn't necessarily mean you've doubled your volume, even though you've doubled the number of decibels. For a logarithmic scale, for the decibel scale, a 3 decibel increase means that a sound is now twice as loud. So it's not exactly a very intuitive scale. So I'm going to say that one more time. If you increase something by 3 decibels, that means it is now twice as loud. So you can see that things get pretty loud pretty quickly on this decibel scale. So using decibels, we've been able to measure some sounds that we are often encountering in our daily lives. So 0 is our absolute threshold, and this scale has been calibrated to that absolute threshold. So on average, a decibel level of 0 is the absolute threshold for hearing. A decibel level of 20 is considered a whisper. So if you've ever been in a situation where you've had to whisper, that's been about a 20 decibel measure. 60 decibels is usually normal conversation level. And 120 decibels is that kind of loud thunder that shakes you out of bed in the middle of the night, that kind of overwhelming, oh my God, I think the house is going to explode kind of thunder. And what we typically see is that Above 85 decibels is when we start to experience damage to the hearing system. And it's not that you're going to experience it right away. It has to be prolonged exposure above that 85 decibel level. So if you're listening to really loud music above 85 decibels, that's when you're going to start to see hearing loss. But if you just briefly are exposed to something like that loud thunder or that really loud car driving by, that's not necessarily going to cause hearing loss. But if you're constantly listening to loud thunder or constantly listening to a loud car drive by, then we'll start to see some problems. I used to teach at the University of Kansas, and every summer in July and August, we would have the cicadas hatch. And oh my gosh, they were just about the loudest little critters I've ever experienced on this planet. I know in Pensacola, Florida, you guys get some cicadas, but it's really nothing like the scale that they get in Kansas. So I love to throw this out there on this little graph here. You can see the bold cicada right there. You can see that cicadas have been clocked in that 90 to 100 decibel range. Yes, that literally means it's above that 85 decibel threshold that cicadas can cause hearing loss. If you are putting your head very, very close to cicadas while they are making their horrible screech, you can experience hearing loss. All right. Let's move on to auditory localization. So, auditory localization refers to how we perceive the location of a sound, where that sound is coming from in our environment. And we do this by some pretty impressive computations. So we perceive, take a look at this little diagram here. So this one on the left, we've got a human represented right here, and we've got the source of a sound represented right here in the middle of all these sound waves emanating out from the source. And we've got all right, so that kind of sets it up, but we're actually going to focus on this image on the right here. So we've got the sound source right here, and we've got the human head just off to the side. So when the sound waves leave this source, they're going to strike this person's head, and based on where they're standing, they're going to hit their right ear first. So the sound waves are going to hit the right ear, and then they're going to hit the left ear. Now, when it hits the right ear, it's just going to be a fraction of a second before it reaches the left ear. But that fraction of a second is enough time for our hearing perceptual processes, our auditory perceptual processes, to make a distinction. So our auditory cortex is able to know that this sound struck our right ear as much as 1/100,000th of a second. That's really hard to say. 1/100,000th of a second before it struck our left ear. And again, that small amount of time is enough for us to make a distinction about where this sound came from in our environment. So again, if sound strikes our right ear first and then our left ear, that sound came from somewhere on the right side of us. Now that's the different times bullet point listed here, but let's move on to the different intensities. So we have what are called sound shadows. And a sound shadow is something that it's created by an object that dampens sound waves to some extent. So going back to this image on the right, we've got our sound source. Those sound waves are traveling, they're striking our head, and our head actually dampens those sound waves a little bit. As those sound waves pass through our skull, pass through our cortex, through our limbic system, and then back out the other side through the other side of our skull, those sound waves come out a little bit less loud. They dampen that sound a little bit. So when these sound waves strike our right ear in this image, they're going to be at full volume. But as they pass through our head to reach our left ear, they're actually going to be a little bit quieter. That sound is going to be dampened just a little bit. And once again, our auditory cortex can pick up on those differences in intensities. So if the right ear picks up sound that's a little bit louder than the left ear hears it, once again, that tells us that sound probably came from the right side of our body. So we use these two cues, different times and different intensities, to determine where a sound came from in our environment. All right, let's move on to something called the McGurk effect. This is a wonderful, easy, simple illusion here. So you're gonna see a video, and that video is linked on the Canvas page. It's a very, very short video. It's about 5 seconds long. And what I'd like you to do is first watch the video with your eyes closed. So watch it with your eyes closed and just try to figure out what it is that you're hearing. So go ahead and watch that now. This would be a great time to pause this lecture. And then the second time you watch that video, go ahead and watch it with your eyes open. And again, try to figure it out what it is you're hearing. Now, I know this is kind of a difficult effect to experience in an online class, but what you might have noticed, or what most people do when they experience the McGurk effect, is when your eyes are closed and you listen to that short little video, you will hear a man repeat the syllable ba, starting with a B as in boy. You'll hear ba, or ba ba, ba ba, ba ba, the letter B as in boy. And that is the actual sound that is being played, is the ba sound. Now, when you open your eyes and watch that video, you most likely heard the da sound. Da, D as in dog. Now, the visual information that you're being fed, that man in that video is actually saying da. The visual video is of a man saying da, D as in dog. But the audio that's being played over that video is ba, B as in boy. So you have conflicting information here. Auditorily, you are hearing the syllable ba, B as in boy. But visually, you are seeing someone say the syllable da, D as in dog. So you have this conflicting information. Your ears are telling you ba, but your eyes are telling you da. So what happens here is that we tend to listen to our eyes. Our eyes kind of take over. It's the dominant perceptual system of our brains. But the bigger point here is that perception is influenced by more than one sense. So our perception of whatever syllable it is that we're hearing is influenced by the syllable that we think we are seeing someone pronounce. This is what's called multimodal perception. Our perceptions depend on more than one sense. What we think we're hearing in our environment is influenced by what we are seeing. And likewise is true as well. What we are seeing in our environment is influenced by what we're hearing. So again, I like to think of the mind as a machine that's desperately trying to make sense of all this incoming information. The Sensomatic Matron 10,000. It's frantically, desperately trying to make sense of this tsunami of incoming sensory information. And that's a hard task. That's a difficult thing for the brain to do. So what does it do? It tries to make it as easy a task as possible. So it's going to use all available information to make those perceptions. It's going to use our sense of vision. It's going to use our sense of hearing to try to understand what it is that's in our environment. And like I mentioned earlier, vision is our dominant sense. we have vision-dominated brains. So if there is a discrepancy, like there is in the McGurk effect, where our eyes are seeing one thing, but our ears are hearing a different thing, we will listen to our eyes. All right. I'm going to make this part one of this second section of sensation and perception, just so this can be broken up into 2 videos to make sure there's no technical glitches here. So that's it for part one of part two. Stand by for part two of part two.